World of Warfare presents the Yelnya Offensive. On June 22nd of 1941, German panzer groups poured into Russia under Operation Barbarossa, quickly overrunning poorly organized Soviet border defenses while destroying nearly half of the entire Soviet air fleet on the ground before pilots could get airborne. By the end of June, some 3.8 million Axis fighters had poured into Russia along an 1,800-mile front. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army led the charge out of Army Group Center's front at Bryansk before splitting into two groups, one headed south, the other to the north, with the intention of encircling Soviet troops of the 3rd and 10th Armies to form the Bialystok and Minsk pockets. 290,000 Soviet troops surrendered on June the 30th, handing over 2,500 tanks and 1,500 guns. In the first week alone, the Nazis inflicted nearly 600,000 Soviet casualties, leading war observers around the world to estimate that the Soviet Union would fall to the Nazis within 6 weeks' time. Meanwhile, the 1st Panzer Army and the 11th Army, both from Army Group South, surged in tandem across Ukraine's Bug River to form the Uman Pocket, surrendering an additional 100,000 men. Kyiv would fall next on September 19th, losing 600,000 more Soviet men, 2,500 tanks and 1,000 guns, before Guderian's Panzer Group rejoined Army Group Center for their relentless drive on Moscow. By the time winter descended on Russia in December, the Soviets had lost almost 2 million men, while their armored vehicles and much of their air fleet had been destroyed, yet at great cost to the Germans as well, who suffered 400,000 casualties and saw 40% of their armor destroyed during the battles of Minsk and Smolensk alone. Despite Russia's early disarray and costly defeats, a fierce determination galvanized the Soviet people, whose immense population allowed the Red Army to launch their own war of attrition, appointing Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov as the Red Army's commander-in-chief, just as winter joined the fight, effectively squashing the Germans' hope of a short war. Stunned by the invasion, Stalin disappeared from public view for nearly 2 weeks, reportedly hiding out in his dacha with full expectations that he would soon be overthrown. Finally re-emerging on July the 3rd, Stalin addressed the Soviet people on public radio, calling for a great patriotic war to defend the motherland, leading the Soviet people to respond to Stalin's challenge despite the catastrophe unfolding along the front. Partisan units formed behind enemy lines, while massive recruitment and conscription efforts ramped into high gear. Entire factories evacuated to the Ural Mountains to escape the Germans' onslaught, where they slowly rebuilt the Red Army's weapons of war amidst an intense spirit of patriotic resistance. Despite the growing wave of patriotism, by late July, the Soviet Red Army found itself teetering on the brink of disaster, just 1 month after Hitler's invasion began. Once bustling with life and prosperity, cities like Vilnius, Riga, and Minsk now lay silent and shattered under the oppression of Nazi control. Yet with their backs against the wall, Stalin and his generals turned their focus to the unfolding Battle of Smolensk, where a potential wild card had emerged in what soon became known as the Yelnya salient. Nestled deep within Soviet-held territory, the salient offered an enticing opportunity for both sides to gain an advantage over their enemy. A 1,000-year-old fortress on the Dnieper River, Smolensk was also a vital transportation hub, where converging rail lines fed directly into the Soviet interior. For the Germans, capturing Smolensk would give them momentum and a logistical advantage, while for the Soviets, holding Smolensk could buy them precious time as they attempted to rebuild their badly weakened military infrastructure. Instead, it was at Smolensk where Germany's blitzkrieg war machine first began to crack. putting an end to Hitler's vision of capturing Moscow by early fall. The battle that followed would last nearly 2 months, yet by its conclusion, the Battle of Smolensk would fundamentally alter the course of the war on the Eastern Front. In response to the German advance, Soviet Western Front commander Marshal Simeon Timoshenko deployed the 16th, 19th, and 20th Armies in and around Smolensk, and while the fresh recruits were poorly coordinated and inadequately equipped, the new conscripts were determined to fight for the future of the Soviet Union. By mid-July, German armored panzers closed in west of Smolensk, encircling large Soviet formations despite the absence of most German infantry units who lagged behind the fast-moving panzer columns by as much as a week. On paper, the Germans' encirclement of Soviet troops appeared to be another classic German victory in the offing, but in reality, the situation proved to be far more complex. While the Germans successfully trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in a pocket west of the city, the encirclement proved to be leaky and contested as Soviet units fought desperately to break out, often launching daring night attacks with precious little artillery support. Others slipped through gaps in the German line, melting into forests and villages before regrouping into cohesive fighting units. For the first time in the campaign, German panzer divisions found themselves fighting prolonged battles rather than racing forward, while inside Smolensk itself, house-to-house street combat erupted throughout the city, where Soviet defenders barricaded streets and fought from cellars and bombed out buildings. Control of the city changed hands multiple times until German forces at last secured most of the city by July 16th. Even though Smolensk had fallen, persistent Soviet counterattacks continued to strike the flanks of German spearheads, particularly against exposed panzer units operating far ahead of their infantry support. German officers accustomed to swift victories found themselves mired in stubborn Soviet resistance in and around Smolensk, as Red Army commanders learned rapidly under the heat of battle, coordinating armor, artillery, and infantry with vastly improved choreographed efficiency. After the Yelnya salient had formed, Hitler made a controversial decision against the advice of his senior generals when he chose to postpone his advance on Moscow by shifting the war's immediate focus to the capture of fertile Ukrainian land to the south, as well as the symbolic city of Leningrad to the north. The decision left the Yelnya salient neglected and vulnerable at a time when the Red Army was undergoing a significant reorganization intended to turn their fortunes from defeat into victory. German forces continued to encircle large Soviet troop formations, just as Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group successfully crossed the Dnieper River. Yet despite the Germans' relentless advance, Brigadier General Walter von Boltenstern's 29th Motorized Division and General Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 failed to link up to close the gap at the Yelnya salient, which allowed thousands of Red Army soldiers to escape impending doom. In response, Guderian ordered Brigadier General Furten von Schall and his 10th Panzer Division to close in on Yelnya and seize it on July 18th, which prompted Soviet Major General Yakov Kohesnikov to order his 19th Rifle Division and some 15,000 Yelnya residents to the task of building anti-tank ditches, artillery placements, and other fortifications around Yelnya in advance of the Germans' attack. Slowed by poor road conditions around Yelnya, as Schall's forces closed in on the city, Soviet defenders attacked the Germans from their newly constructed fortifications, prompting Schall to split his forces into 2 combat groups in an effort to flank Red Army positions. The maneuver proved a success, which forced the Red Army into a retreat that cost thousands of Soviet casualties. Other Soviet troops held their ground in the city until 1430 hours, when intense house-to-house combat broke out after the 10th Panzer Division entered the city. Kozevnikov's holdout troops fought valiantly in the streets and homes of Yelnya, Yet in the end, the city fell to Nazi occupation by sunset. Given Yelnya's proximity to Moscow, and unaware of Hitler's change in objectives on the Eastern Front, Stalin, Timoshenko, and Zhukov agreed to launch a counteroffensive to block the Germans from attacking Moscow, sending in a massive amount of reinforcements to join Red Army troops now encircling Yelnya. As the reinforcements approached the city, however, the Germans divided their troops to confront the new arrivals, initiating devastating artillery strikes, followed by the combined advance of armor and infantry. Brutal hand-to-hand combat picked up yet again, yet the Germans began to experience supply strains on fuel, ammunition, and spare part shortages, which severely impacted their operational capabilities. The attacks tore into the last remnants of the Soviet 19th Rifle Division, until the Soviet 100th and 103rd Rifle Divisions moved in to protect Kozhevnikov's flanks. After the Soviets deployed batteries of Katyusha rocket launchers against the Germans, the Red Army at last began to push back against the Nazis' offensive. In the final week of July, the Soviets launched more counterattacks across the entire Yelnya salient with varied results. Yet during these final attempts to hold the city, the Germans soon realized that the Soviets were determined to retake the city at all costs. Despite their ongoing tenacity, the Germans steadily began to give up ground as the Soviets received additional reinforcements along the entire front line of the battlefield. Despite the Germans' ongoing shortages, German artillery units carefully selected their targets in a battle where neither side gave or asked for quarter. And as the weeks passed and August drew to a close, Soviet pressure intensified with the arrival of fresh divisions from Zhukov's newly formed reserve front. In a war of attrition which increasingly favored the Soviets, the Red Army entered the devastated city on August 23rd. Over the coming days, Zhukov orchestrated coordinated airstrikes and infantry assaults aimed at clearing the Germans from the salient. On September 3rd, facing the very real possibility of encirclement, German forces began a retreat from the salient by maintaining resistance on their flanks, and after a week of brutal combat, Hitler at last permitted Wieter von Bock's Army Group Center to evacuate the Yelnya bridgehead. What was left of Yelnya was officially retaken by the Red Army on September 6th, effectively pushing the Germans back to a new defensive line by September the 8th. By the time the Yelnya offensive was over, the Germans had suffered 23,000 killed, missing, or wounded, while the Soviets had endured at least 31,853 casualties, including 10,701 killed or missing and 21,152 wounded. The Yelnya offensive was the first substantial reverse that the Wehrmacht had suffered during Barbarossa, and while Germany's defeat at Yelnya was recognized by most German soldiers who had fought in the battle, under the manipulating hands of the Reich's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Yelnya was sold to the German people as a planned operational fortification maneuver meant to strengthen Germany's front line on the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, on the other hand, their victory at Yelnya became a crucial morale boost for Soviet citizens and soldiers alike, strengthening Soviet resolve for the fight ahead, a fight which would ultimately lead them onto the streets of Berlin.